I stood in the pouring rain, stripped of my car keys and my dignity, while my father and brother toasted to their new empire. They thought burying my grandfather meant burying my place in the family. My dad had just inherited the entire estate, sneering that I would not get a single cent. He crowned my lazy brother the next heir, and literally had security throw me out of the house. But they made one catastrophic mistake. They never bothered to check who actually owned the ground they were standing on. My name is Paige. I am 33 years old and a director of mergers and acquisitions at a private equity firm. The heavy oak doors of the family mansion had barely closed behind the last funeral guest when the dull thud of leather hitting mahogany echoed through the study. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in a wealthy Chicago suburb, the family real estate business was everything. My grandfather Winston built his commercial property empire from scratch with dirt under his nails and a brilliant mind for zoning laws. Inside our sprawling estate, however, the air was always thick with unearned arrogance. My father, Richard, was merely a caretaker of that wealth, a man who loved the title of executive but despised the actual work. Our house was a fortress of traditional outdated expectations, where sons were groomed for leadership and daughters were expected to look pretty and marry well. I rejected that narrative early on. I moved to New York, climbed the brutal ladder of Wall Street, and made my own name in corporate acquisitions. The day we buried Grandpa Winston, the grief was still raw in my chest. But for my father and my brother Trent, it was coronation day. The moment the last sympathetic relative pulled out of the driveway, my father called us into the study. The room still smelled of Grandpa's pipe tobacco, but the atmosphere was completely toxic. Richard slammed a massive leather-bound ledger onto the antique conference table. He stood at the head of the room, adjusting his custom Italian tie, and looked at me with a sickeningly triumphant grin. He announced that Winston had died intestate. There was no will to be found. According to state law, as the only surviving child, my father inherited the entire estate. Every building, every bank account, every subsidiary. He did not even pause to mourn. In his very next breath, he turned to my 35-year-old brother Trent and officially handed him the title of Chief Executive Officer of the family firm. Trent was already lounging on the vintage Chesterfield sofa, pouring himself a massive glass of a $500 scotch that Grandpa had been saving for a special occasion. Trent smirked at me over the rim of his crystal glass. This was a man who had bankrupted 3 different commercial development projects in the last 5 years, losing millions of dollars because he preferred playing golf to reviewing financial models. My father had quietly covered up every single one of those failures, blaming the market, the contractors, or the economy. I stood my ground and calmly demanded a full financial audit. I reminded my father that Grandpa Winston had made verbal promises not just to me, but to several long-term employees who had helped build the company. I told them that running a commercial real estate empire without a transition plan or an audit was corporate suicide. My father laughed. It was a cold, dismissive sound that bounced off the wood-paneled walls. He pointed a finger at me and called me a soulless corporate vulture. He said I had disgraced the family by working in private equity, dealing in hostile takeovers and ruthless liquidations, instead of serving the family legacy. He told me I had no loyalty and therefore I had no rights. He looked me dead in the eye and said I was cut out completely. That was when Simone stepped forward. Simone is Trent's wife. She is 32 years old, African-American, flawlessly stunning, fiercely pragmatic, and brutally sharp. She married Trent, knowing exactly what he was, a weak man with a massive trust fund. Simone was the brains behind his fragile ego, and she never missed an opportunity to put me in my place. She walked over to where I was standing, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. With a sweet, venomous smile, she held out her hand and demanded the keys to my Porsche. The car had been a gift from Grandpa Winston when I closed my first $100 million acquisition. He had been so proud of me. But legally, for tax purposes, the car was registered under the family company name. Simone knew this. She tilted her head, her diamond earrings catching the light, and mocked my entire existence. She said it was time for the independent, tough corporate woman to finally stand on her own 2 feet. She said since I loved working on Wall Street so much, I surely did not need any handouts from the family business anymore. She completely ignored the fact that Trent had been living off Grandpa's handouts his entire adult life. She told me Trent was the rightful heir, the golden child who was meant to lead, and that my presence was no longer required or desired. I looked at Trent, who was busy taking another sip of his scotch, entirely letting his wife do the dirty work. I looked at my father, who was watching with quiet satisfaction. I reached into my designer bag, pulled out the heavy set of keys, and dropped them into Simone's perfectly manicured hand. The metal clinked against her rings. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. My lack of a dramatic reaction only angered my father more. He wanted me to beg. He wanted me to cry and apologize for being too ambitious. When I simply stared at him with cold indifference, his face flushed with rage. He picked up his phone and ordered the estate security to escort me off the property. He demanded that I be stripped of my access cards to the family headquarters and the mansion. The security guards, men who had known me since I was a teenager, looked incredibly uncomfortable as they walked into the study. But they had a job to do. They asked me to step outside. As I walked out the heavy front doors, the sky broke open. It was a torrential downpour, the kind of freezing heavy rain that instantly soaked through my dark morning dress. I stood at the edge of the long driveway, watching the massive iron gates slowly close, locking me out of the only childhood home I had ever known. I did not break down. I stood in the freezing rain and carefully memorized the smug, victorious expressions on their faces, looking down at me from the second-floor window. Let them have their victory lap. Let them drink the expensive scotch and play king of the castle. I hailed a cab in the rain and headed back to my sleek, quiet apartment in the city. By the time I stepped out of a hot shower, my phone was buzzing relentlessly on the kitchen island. Trent had already sent me a series of taunting text messages. He sent a picture of himself sitting in Grandpa's massive leather desk chair, his feet propped up on the mahogany. The caption read, "Looks like the vulture is finally out of the nest. Good luck paying your city rent without the family safety net." I poured myself a glass of water, reading the messages with a detached, clinical eye. They were so confident. They were so incredibly blind to the reality of the business world. They thought power was something you inherited through blood. In my world, power was something you orchestrated through airtight legal contracts. Suddenly, a firm, rhythmic knock broke the silence of my apartment. It was nearly midnight. The storm was still raging against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. I tied my silk robe tight and walked to the front door, checking the security monitor. Standing in the hallway, looking completely unbothered by the late hour, was Desmond. Desmond was 45 years old, sharp, intensely private, and arguably the most dangerous corporate attorney in the city. More importantly, he was Grandpa Winston's most trusted legal counsel, a man who operated entirely in the shadows. He was the architect of Winston's most complex business maneuvers. I unlocked the door and let him in. Desmond did not offer empty condolences or small talk. He walked straight to my kitchen island, his expensive leather briefcase snapping open with a sharp click. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope embossed with a discreet gold logo. He slid the envelope across the cool marble surface toward me. Desmond looked me dead in the eyes, his expression completely unreadable. He whispered, "Your grandfather knew exactly what your father and brother would do the moment he was gone. He prepared for this 5 years ago. It is time to tell them who you really are." My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands were completely steady as I broke the gold seal on the envelope. I pulled out a thick stack of highly confidential legal documents, corporate filings, and trust agreements. I am a mergers and acquisitions expert. I read complex financial structures for a living. It only took me 3 pages to realize exactly what I was looking at. I read the terms of the private equity trust, the dates of the asset transfers, and the restructuring of the family subsidiary. The deeper I read, the wider my smile grew. It was a predatory, devastating smile. I looked up at Desmond, who gave a single knowing nod. I was not unemployed. I was not cut out of the estate. And I was certainly not defenseless. The kings sitting in their castle had absolutely no idea that I owned the mortgage, the walls, and the ground beneath their feet. The real game had just begun. The morning sun reflected off the glass facade of the family company headquarters, a sleek skyscraper sitting right in the heart of the Chicago financial district. I walked through the revolving doors with a perfectly tailored navy blue suit and a single empty cardboard box. The security guards at the front desk averted their eyes. The receptionist, a sweet woman named Nancy who had worked for my grandfather for 20 years, gave me a tight, sorrowful smile. I did not need an access card to get to the executive floor today. I was just there to collect my personal belongings, but my real objective was to observe the new kings in their natural habitat. I took the private elevator up to the penthouse suite, the doors opening to a scene of absolute chaos. My grandfather had spent decades cultivating an office environment of quiet, understated power, rich mahogany leather seating, and silence. But less than 24 hours after his funeral, the floor was swarming with private contractors. Simone stood in the center of the executive lobby, holding a tablet and snapping her fingers at a crew of painters. She was dressed in a pristine white designer suit, looking every bit the ruthless queen she believed herself to be. She was loudly ordering the workers to tear down the classic wooden wall paneling to replace it with frosted glass and neon accents. She called my grandfather's aesthetic suffocating and cheap, apparently forgetting that his suffocating aesthetic had funded her lavish lifestyle for the past 5 years. I walked past her without a word and headed straight into the main corner office. My grandfather's desk, a massive piece of antique oak, had been completely cleared of his architectural models and family photos. Sitting in the oversized leather chair, leaning back with his designer shoes resting right on the polished wood, was Trent. He was on his phone laughing loudly with a luxury boat broker. He hung up when I walked in, his smug expression instantly returning. He asked if I was lost, or if I had forgotten that I no longer worked there. I calmly set my cardboard box down on a side table and began gathering my personal framed diplomas and a few specialized financial reference books. I did not take the bait. My silence only made him want to provoke me more. Trent stood up, smoothing his tailored jacket, and walked over to me. He puffed out his chest, trying to project the authority he severely lacked. I looked at him and thought about his track record. This was a man who had spearheaded 3 major commercial strip mall developments over the last 5 years. Every single one had ended in complete disaster. He ignored zoning laws, hired cheap labor to pocket the difference, and ultimately drove the projects into bankruptcy. My father had to quietly siphon millions from the company's emergency reserves to bail Trent out and settle the lawsuits out of court. Yet here he was standing in the CEO office, utterly convinced of his own genius. Simone walked in, leaning against the doorframe with a satisfied smirk. She told Trent not to be too hard on me because the job market was tough for people who had just been fired for incompetence. It was a fascinating display of psychological projection. I finished packing my box, ensuring everything was neatly arranged, and picked it up. I looked at Trent and asked if he had bothered to review the quarterly operating expenses before ordering a complete office renovation. Trent laughed, walking back to the desk. He opened the top drawer, pulled out the heavy corporate checkbook, and grabbed a solid gold pen. He said he did not need to look at spreadsheets because he was the boss now and the boss makes the rules. He quickly scribbled on a check, ripped it from the ledger, and walked back to me. With a loud, dramatic sigh intended for the contractors in the hallway to hear, he shoved the check into my hand. It was a check for $5,000. Trent loudly announced that it was a pity donation, a little charity to help me pay my rent until I could find a junior position somewhere else. He told me to consider it his first philanthropic act as CEO. Simone giggled from the doorway, adding that I should probably use it to buy some clothes that did not look so aggressively corporate. I looked down at the piece of paper in my hand. It was drawn directly from the company's primary operating account. I smiled gracefully, folded the check, and slipped it into the breast pocket of my blazer. I looked Trent dead in the eye and thanked him for the generous contribution. I then casually mentioned that he might want to keep a close eye on the company's operating liquidity and double-check the subsidiary debt ratios before signing any more checks. Trent blinked. The technical terminology completely short-circuited his brain for a fraction of a second. He quickly recovered, puffing out his chest and telling me to save my boring Wall Street jargon for someone who actually cared. Simone scoffed, telling Trent to ignore me because I was just using big words to sound smart and intimidate them. I nodded slowly, picked up my box, and walked out of the office. They thought they had humiliated me. They had no idea they had just handed me written proof that they were recklessly bleeding an account they did not legally control. That evening, my father hosted his grand New Era dinner at the Oakwood Country Club. It was the most exclusive club in the city, an old money institution where deals were made over rare steaks and vintage scotch. Richard had invited the 12 largest private investors of the family firm to officially introduce Trent as the new visionary leader. I knew about the dinner because I still maintained my own platinum membership at Oakwood, paid for entirely by my personal wealth. I arrived an hour into their dinner service. I wore a striking emerald green evening gown that commanded attention the moment I stepped into the private dining room. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the entire table fell dead silent. My father was mid-sentence, raising his glass for a toast, but the words died in his throat. Trent looked like he was going to choke on his Wagyu beef. Simone, wearing a blindingly expensive diamond necklace that she had certainly bought that morning, glared at me with pure hatred. My father quickly stood up, his face flushed with anger. He marched over to me and hissed under his breath, demanding to know what I was doing there. I smiled politely, signaling the waiter to bring me a glass of sparkling water. I told my father I was simply enjoying my club membership and wanted to greet the investors. I walked past him and took an empty seat at the far end of the massive table directly across from a very conservative, risk-averse investor named Arthur. I apologize, I meant a very conservative investor named Thomas. Simone could not handle the shift in attention. She immediately tried to regain control of the room by loudly mocking my presence. She leaned across the table and told the investors that I was just bitter because I had been let go from the family business earlier that day. She laughed a high-pitched grating sound and bragged that the company was finally in capable hands. To prove her point, she proudly announced to the entire table that Trent had just signed a contract for a $2 million luxury yacht that afternoon. She boasted that Trent was going to use the yacht to entertain international clients and show the world that the firm was entering a glamorous new chapter. The silence that followed her announcement was deafening. The investors at the table exchanged highly concerned glances. In the commercial real estate world especially, right after the death of a founding patriarch, buying a $2 million depreciating liability using corporate funds is a massive red flag. Thomas cleared his throat, looking directly at my father, and asked if the board had approved such a massive capital expenditure. My father began sweating profusely. He stammered, tugging at his collar, and tried to assure Thomas that it was a strategic marketing investment. Trent chimed in, making matters worse by arrogantly stating that as the new CEO, he did not need board approval for marketing expenses. I simply sat at the end of the table, sipping my sparkling water, watching them dig their own graves with a golden shovel. The dinner painfully dragged on for another hour. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. The investors asked probing financial questions that Trent completely failed to answer, forcing my father to constantly interrupt and deflect. By the time the dessert plates were cleared, my father was desperate to end the night on a high note. He aggressively signaled the maitre d' to bring the final bill. The Oakwood Country Club is not cheap. With the private room fee, the imported Wagyu, the vintage bottles of wine, and the rare Cuban cigars my father had handed out, the bill came to exactly $40,000. My father confidently pulled out the heavy metal corporate black card and placed it on the silver tray, giving the investors a reassuring, wealthy smile. The maitre d' bowed respectfully and walked away. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The conversation at the table was strained. Finally, the club manager, a stern man named Mr. Sterling, approached the table. I apologize, a stern man named Mr. Vance. No, let me correct that. A stern man named Mr. Higgins approached the table. He looked incredibly pale and extremely uncomfortable. He leaned down and whispered into my father's ear. My father's face went completely rigid. He laughed nervously, pulled out his wallet, and handed Mr. Higgins a different corporate platinum card. He told the table it was just a security fraud alert, a common annoyance for high net worth accounts. Mr. Higgins took the second card and hurried away. 3 minutes later, Mr. Higgins returned. This time he did not whisper. He stood at the head of the table holding the silver tray with the 2 rejected credit cards sitting on top of the $40,000 receipt. He cleared his throat and spoke in a clear, apologetic tone that carried across the entire silent room. He informed my father that both cards had been permanently declined. He stated that the bank had attached a specific error code to the rejection. The accounts had been completely frozen and locked by the parent entity due to unauthorized subsidiary spending. The words parent entity hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The investor stared at my father in absolute shock. A company does not just get its accounts frozen by a parent entity unless it is secretly owned by a larger conglomerate or it is in severe default. My father stood up his chair, scraping violently against the floor. He started screaming at Mr. Higgins, a complete departure from his refined country club persona. He yelled that the machine was broken, that he owned the city, and that he would have Mr. Higgins fired by morning. Trent looked panicked, patting his pockets, as if he could magically produce $40,000 in cash. Simone sank back into her chair, her face burning with humiliation as the wealthy wives of the investors judged her in absolute silence. I slowly stood up, smoothing the front of my emerald gown. I placed a crisp $100 bill on the table to cover my sparkling water. I looked at my father, who was still red-faced and hyperventilating, and gave him a mock, sympathetic wave. I told him it looked like they were going to have to wash dishes to pay off that vintage wine. I turned my back on them and walked out of the private dining room, the sharp click of my heels echoing in the silent hallway. I left them to face the financial elite of the city, with empty pockets and a hollow empire. The trap had been set, the bait was swallowed, and the first drop of blood had finally been drawn. The fallout from the country club dinner was instantaneous and catastrophic. While I drove back to my downtown apartment in silence, listening to the gentle hum of the city, my father and brother were experiencing a completely different reality. I later learned from our longtime estate manager exactly how the rest of their night unfolded. The heavy mahogany doors of the family mansion slammed shut, echoing through the empty, cavernous halls. Richard was hyperventilating. He tore off his custom Italian tie and threw it onto the marble floor. Trent was pacing frantically back and forth across the Persian rug, his earlier arrogance having completely evaporated. Simone stood by the grand fireplace, her arms tightly crossed, glaring at both of them with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Richard immediately grabbed the house phone and dialed the private emergency line for the bank's wealth management division. He was screaming at the automated system, demanding to speak to a senior executive. When he finally got a human being on the line, the conversation only made things worse. The bank representative calmly explained that the corporate accounts were completely restricted due to a subsidiary debt default. Richard demanded to know what subsidiary the man was talking about. He insisted he owned the parent company. The representative patiently stated that, according to the updated federal filings, the family firm was registered as a subsidiary of a private trust called Apex Holdings. Due to a massive outstanding debt, the parent company had enacted a legal emergency asset freeze. Richard dropped the phone. It clattered against the hardwood floor. Trent stopped pacing and asked his father what that meant. Simone, realizing her access to millions of dollars had just been cut off in the blink of an eye, turned her fury entirely on her husband. She asked Trent how he could possibly accept the title of chief executive officer and not even know that his own company was a subsidiary. She began verbally shredding his competence. She mocked his fake millionaire status, pointing out that every single thing he owned, from his designer suits to his imported cars, was suddenly worthless if the accounts were frozen. She reminded him that the check he wrote for the luxury yacht was going to bounce by tomorrow afternoon. The first real crack in their toxic alliance had officially formed, and it was beautiful. With the yacht payment due in less than 24 hours and the city's wealthiest investors already smelling blood in the water, absolute panic set in. Trent was terrified of facing federal wire fraud charges if the massive check for the boat bounced. Richard was paralyzed by the fear of losing his prestigious country club status and his carefully curated reputation among the financial elite. They needed liquid cash, and they needed it immediately. In a moment of pure desperation, Richard suggested selling Grandpa Winston's most prized asset. It was a massive, undeveloped commercial plot sitting right in the center of the downtown tech district. Winston had held on to that specific piece of land for 20 years. He always refused to sell it because he knew the city's zoning laws were eventually going to change, which would multiply its value tenfold. It was his masterpiece, the crown jewel of his portfolio. But Richard and Trent did not care about the future. They did not care about legacy or strategic growth. They only cared about surviving the week and saving their own fragile egos. Simone stepped in, her ruthless pragmatism overriding her anger. She told them she could leverage her extensive real estate connections to find an anonymous private buyer, someone who had the capital to close the deal in cash within 24 hours. But there was a catch. To move that much money that fast without raising red flags or going through standard corporate appraisals, they would have to take a massive 40% loss on the property's actual market value. They would be practically giving it away. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second, briefly remembering how much Winston loved that land. But Trent, desperate to save his own skin and secure his ridiculous yacht, pressured him relentlessly. Trent argued that it was just empty dirt, and that they could buy it back later when the cash flow stabilized. Blinded by panic and the illusion of a quick fix, Richard agreed. The very next afternoon, the closing took place in a sterile, windowless conference room at a neutral title company downtown. Simone sat at the table, gloating quietly and taking full credit for saving the family from public humiliation. Richard and Trent sat across from her, sweating through their expensive suits, eagerly waiting for the buyer's representative to arrive with the wire transfer confirmation. The heavy glass door opened. It was not some faceless corporate drone or a junior real estate agent. It was Desmond. Richard looked completely confused. He stood up, forcing a polite smile, and asked Desmond what he was doing there, assuming the lawyer had just stopped by to offer late condolences regarding the frozen accounts. Desmond did not smile. He calmly sat down at the opposite end of the table, placed his sleek titanium briefcase on the polished wood, and pulled out the massive stack of purchase agreements. Desmond announced in his smooth, unbothered voice that he was the legal representative for the anonymous buyer. Richard and Trent were so desperate for the cash injection that they did not even pause to question the coincidence. They were completely blinded by their own greed. They did not read the fine print. They did not look at the LLC name buried on page 42 of the contract. They just grabbed the pens and started signing away Winston's most valuable piece of land for pennies on the dollar. As Desmond packed up the fully executed documents he offered, a polite, chilling nod stepped out of the room and immediately called my cell phone. I was sitting in my own office, staring at my dual monitors, watching the heavily discounted wire transfer go through. I smiled as the digital confirmation lit up my screen. I had just bought back my grandfather's greatest legacy using the very money they thought they were stealing from me. They thought they had survived the storm, but they had absolutely no idea that I was the one controlling the weather. With the heavily discounted wire transfer clearing their bank and temporarily lifting the emergency freeze on their subsidiary accounts, my father's bruised ego demanded immediate public validation. They thought the worst was over. They believed that sacrificing my grandfather's most valuable piece of real estate had successfully plugged the gaping hole in their sinking ship. In their arrogant minds, they had outsmarted the bank, secured their luxury yacht, and re-established their dominance. To celebrate this illusion of victory, Richard decided it was time to officially crown Trent before the eyes of the entire city. He booked the grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, inviting every major financial journalist, real estate blogger, and local news anchor in Chicago. The official press release claimed the event was to announce the new visionary direction of the family empire following Winston's passing. But I knew my father better than anyone. The real purpose of this media circus was damage control. He needed to get ahead of the rumors generated by the disastrous country club dinner, and more importantly, he needed to publicly destroy my reputation before I could challenge his authority. I arrived at the hotel 30 minutes early, dressed in a sharp-tailored crimson suit that commanded attention. I did not enter through the VIP doors. Instead, I quietly slipped into the back of the room, blending in with the dense crowd of reporters, camera crews, and photographers. I carried a sleek leather briefcase containing 50 meticulously prepared press kits. Each kit held a verified financial audit, corporate structural diagrams, and legally binding debt notices. The lights dimmed and a hush fell over the room as my father stepped up to the podium. He looked every inch the distinguished patriarch, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. Trent stood slightly behind him to the right, puffing out his chest, trying to look like a seasoned executive rather than a man who spent his afternoons on golf courses. Simone stood to the left, wearing another new designer dress, smiling warmly for the cameras. They looked like the perfect, impenetrable American dynasty. Richard adjusted the microphone and began his speech. He started with a well-rehearsed, tearful tribute to Grandpa Winston, praising his hard work and legacy. Then seamlessly, he pivoted to his actual agenda. He announced that Trent was officially taking over as Chief Executive Officer to lead the company into a modern, aggressive era of expansion. The cameras flashed blindingly as Trent offered a stiff, rehearsed wave. Then came the knife twist. Richard's face grew solemn. He leaned into the microphone and stated that with new leadership comes the difficult task of cleaning house. He told the room full of journalists that it was with a heavy heart that the board had to terminate my employment. He did not just say I was fired. He actively assassinated my character on live television. He claimed that I had engaged in severe ethical violations, that my time in private equity had poisoned my morals, and that I had been caught attempting to embezzle from my grandfather's charitable funds. He played the role of the heartbroken but fiercely protective father to absolute perfection. A murmur rippled through the press pool, pencils scribbled furiously. It was the perfect scandalous headline: "Wealthy heiress caught stealing from dead grandfather." Simone looked down at her manicured nails, hiding a deeply satisfied smirk. Trent looked incredibly proud of himself. I decided they had enjoyed the spotlight long enough. I unlatched my briefcase and began quietly passing the thick folders to the journalists standing directly around me. The financial reporter from the Chicago Tribune, a sharp-eyed woman named Helen, opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the first page and her jaw physically dropped. I stepped out from the shadows of the back row and walked directly down the center aisle. The click of my heels against the marble floor cut through the quiet murmuring. I stopped at the main microphone stand, reserved for the press pool. I looked directly up at the stage. My father's confident smile instantly evaporated. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. Trent took a nervous step backward, bumping into the promotional banner behind him. I leaned into the microphone. My voice was calm, steady, and amplified across the entire ballroom. I thanked Richard for the fascinating fictional story. I then instructed every journalist in the room to open the folders currently circulating among them and turn to page 4. The sound of rustling paper filled the massive room. I kept my eyes locked on my father as I translated the complex financial data into a brutal, undeniable reality. I announced to the press that the company Richard was boasting about was no longer an independent empire. I revealed that 5 years ago, Grandpa Winston had legally restructured the entire family business into a mere subsidiary of a private holding company called Apex Holdings. I watched the color completely drain from Richard's face. I told the journalist to look at the debt schedule on page 6. I explained that the family subsidiary was currently operating with a massive $15 million deficit owed directly to the parent company. I raised my voice just enough to cut through the sudden frantic whispering of the reporters. I asked Richard how he planned to fund Trent's new era of expansion when the company's bank accounts had been frozen for subsidiary debt default just 48 hours ago. Chaos erupted. Hands shot into the air. Camera flashes became a blinding strobe light. Helen from the Tribune shouted over the noise, asking Richard to confirm if the family business was functionally insolvent. Another reporter yelled out, asking if it was true that they had just panic sold their prime downtown commercial lot at a 40% loss just to cover a bounced check for a luxury yacht. Simone's warm smile shattered. She snapped her head toward Trent, her eyes wide with panic as the reality of the situation finally hit her. The reporters were no longer interested in Richard's fabricated story about my embezzlement. They had cold, hard, verified financial documents in their hands, proving that the men on stage were absolute frauds. Richard stuttered into the microphone, his voice trembling. He tried to claim the documents were forged. He threatened to sue the journalists if they printed a single word of it. But it was completely useless. The data was authenticated by federal routing numbers and registered corporate seals. I did not stop there. I delivered the final crushing blow. I leaned back into the microphone and asked Richard if he would like to know who actually owned Apex Holdings. I asked him if he wanted to know who had just purchased Grandpa Winston's prized land for pennies on the dollar. Before he could answer, I introduced myself to the press pool, not as the disgraced daughter, but as the chief executive officer and majority shareholder of Apex Holdings. I smiled at my father, a cold, predatory smile that promised absolute destruction. I told him his rent was past due. Richard practically tore the microphone from the podium, signaling for his PR team to cut the audio. He grabbed Trent by the arm and shoved him toward the backstage exit. Simone did not follow them immediately. She stood frozen on the stage, staring at me with a mixture of absolute terror and realization. She had married the golden child for his crown, only to discover on live television that I was the one who owned the kingdom. The press conference had turned into a live broadcast of their complete and utter financial execution. The flashing lights of the press pool cameras illuminated the grand ballroom like a lightning storm, but I did not stay to answer their frantic questions. I had delivered the truth, and the evidence was in their hands. I turned away from the podium and walked calmly down the center aisle, leaving the chaotic hum of the Plaza Hotel behind me. My phone buzzed the moment I stepped out into the crisp Chicago air. It was Desmond. His voice was smooth and purely professional, informing me that the official default notices had just been hand-delivered to the family corporate headquarters. The legal trap had successfully snapped shut. While I climbed into the back of my waiting town car, the reality of the situation was violently crashing down on the people I had left behind. Simone was the last one to leave the stage. According to Helen from the Tribune, who eagerly published a detailed account of the fallout an hour later, Simone looked like she had seen a ghost. The brilliant, pragmatic woman who had married my brother for his inherited crown finally understood that the crown was made of paper. When Simone arrived back at the luxury penthouse she shared with Trent, the illusion was completely shattered. Trent was frantically throwing clothes into a suitcase, downing the last of his expensive scotch directly from the bottle. He was babbling incoherently about fleeing to a non-extradition country before the federal wire fraud investigators realized his yacht check had bounced. Simone did not join his panic. She stood in the doorway of their massive walk-in closet, her eyes cold and calculating. She asked him point-blank if he had known about Apex Holdings. Trent, cowardly to the bitter end, tried to lie. He claimed it was a setup, a forged document I had created to steal his rightful inheritance. But Simone was not stupid. She had heard the conviction in my voice and seen the absolute terror on my father's face. She walked over to her vanity mirror, unclasped the blindingly expensive diamond necklace she had bought on company credit just days ago, and let it drop into the trash can. She told Trent he was the most pathetic excuse for a man she had ever met. She verbally shredded his entire existence, pointing out that without his grandfather's money, he was nothing but an arrogant, incompetent fraud who could not even read a basic subsidiary contract. Trent tried to yell back, trying to assert his authority as her husband and the supposed CEO, but Simone simply laughed in his face. She grabbed her own set of designer luggage, packed only the items she had purchased with her own money before they were married, and walked toward the door. She told him she was filing for divorce first thing in the morning and that he should probably start looking for a good public defender because she was not going to pay his legal fees. The heavy penthouse door slammed shut, echoing the finality of their toxic alliance. The next morning, the atmosphere at the family company headquarters was completely unrecognizable. Just 48 hours earlier, it had been a bustling hub of arrogant renovations and reckless spending. Now it was a ghost town. The contractors had abandoned the executive floor the moment they saw the morning news, knowing their invoices would never be paid. Half the staff had called in sick, already updating their resumes. My father was sitting in the partially demolished corner office, surrounded by torn drywall and exposed wires. He looked like he had aged 20 years overnight. His bespoke charcoal suit was deeply wrinkled, and his hands trembled as he stared at the mountain of certified mail piled on the desk. Foreclosure notices, bankruptcy warnings, and immediate cease and desist orders from Apex Holdings. The walls were literally and metaphorically closing in on him. In a final desperate act of delusion, Richard refused to accept defeat. He believed he could still talk his way out of it. He believed that his charm and his country club connections could save him. He picked up the phone and ordered his terrified remaining secretary to summon the minority shareholders for an emergency board meeting. These were the wealthy silent partners who held small percentage stakes in the subsidiary. Richard planned to beg them for an immediate emergency capital injection, a massive cash bailout, to pay off Apex Holdings and regain control of the firm. He scheduled the meeting for 1 o'clock that afternoon in the main executive boardroom. He spent the entire morning drafting a speech planning to frame me as a rogue, vengeful daughter who had manipulated a sick old man into signing over the company. He thought if he played the victim well enough, his wealthy friends would open their checkbooks. What Richard did not realize was that the minority shareholders had already read the morning papers. They had already seen the verified financial audits I handed out at the press conference. And more importantly, they had already received personal phone calls from Desmond that morning. At 12:45, I stepped out of my office building downtown. I was wearing a stark white, impeccably tailored suit. It was a deliberate choice, a visual statement of complete control and untarnished authority. Desmond fell into step beside me, holding his titanium briefcase. Behind him walked 4 of the most ruthless, highly paid corporate litigators in the city. We did not speak as we climbed into the waiting vehicles. There was nothing left to discuss. The strategy was flawless, the execution was complete, and all that remained was the final collection. We pulled up to the family headquarters just as the clock struck 1. I did not bother stopping at the reception desk. I walked straight to the private executive elevator and scanned my personal access card. The card reader, which my father had ordered deactivated days ago, instantly flashed green. As the majority shareholder and CEO of the parent company, my access overrode any subsidiary commands. The elevator doors slid shut, carrying me up to the penthouse floor. It was time to walk into that boardroom and take everything they had ever valued, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the consequences of their own arrogance. The metallic chime of the elevator arriving at the penthouse floor sounded like a death knell. The polished steel doors slid open smoothly, and I stepped onto the thick carpet of the executive level. The hallway was completely dead and quiet, save for the muffled sound of my father's voice echoing from the main boardroom at the end of the corridor. Desmond walked to my right, completely unbothered and incredibly sharp, while my team of corporate litigators fanned out slightly behind us. We reached the massive frosted glass doors of the boardroom. I did not knock or wait for an invitation. I placed both hands on the sleek metal handles and pushed them open with commanding force. Inside the room, Richard was standing at the head of the long mahogany table. He had a perfectly constructed expression of sorrow plastered on his face, caught right in the middle of a speech about how Grandpa Winston's tragic passing had left the company temporarily vulnerable. Sitting around the massive table were 6 of the wealthiest minority shareholders in Chicago. They were the silent partners who held small stakes in the family business. They all turned their heads to look at the doorway. Richard stopped speaking mid-sentence. His face contorted from fake manufactured grief to genuine panic. He pointed a shaking finger at me and immediately yelled at the two security guards standing by the door to escort me off the premises. The guards, two large men in dark suits, who had known me for years, did not move a single muscle. Richard yelled at them again, his voice cracking with desperation, threatening that they were fired if they did not physically grab me and throw me out. I smiled. It was a calm, collected expression that seemed to infuriate him even more. I informed my father that he could not fire them because they no longer worked for his payroll. I had personally renegotiated the building's security contract at 8 o'clock that morning through my holding company. They answered exclusively to me now. I walked confidently down the length of the room. The minority shareholders watched in stunned silence as I bypassed the empty chairs and stopped right next to my father at the head of the table. I did not ask him to move. I simply stared at him until the sheer weight of his own powerlessness forced him to step aside. I took his seat, the leather chair that had belonged to my grandfather. Desmond stepped forward, snapping open his titanium briefcase and beginning to pass out thick, legally certified binders to each of the shareholders. I folded my hands on the polished mahogany and looked at the men who had helped build this company. I told them that Richard had called this emergency meeting to beg for their money to ask for a massive capital injection to save a sinking ship. But I warned them that throwing their wealth into this subsidiary would be exactly like burning it in a furnace. Richard slammed his hands on the table, demanding I stop lying and accusing me of corporate sabotage. However, one of the senior shareholders, an older gentleman named Jonathan, raised his hand and sternly told Richard to sit down and shut up. Jonathan stated that he wanted to hear exactly what I had to say. I opened my own binder and looked directly at my father. I explained exactly why Grandpa Winston never left a traditional will. 5 years ago, Grandpa caught Trent embezzling nearly $1 million from a commercial development fund to pay off his massive hidden gambling debts. Instead of calling the police, sending his grandson to prison, and destroying the family name in the press, Grandpa took a different route. He completely and legally restructured the entire family empire. He secretly transferred every single piece of valuable real estate, every intellectual property patent, and all the liquid capital into a blind trust called Apex Holdings. He then downgraded the original family firm, the one Richard thought he inherited, into a hollow, useless subsidiary. I explained that the subsidiary only operated by leasing the buildings and the branding rights from Apex Holdings at a massive compounding premium. It was a financial leash designed to keep Trent and Richard under strict control. As long as Grandpa was alive, he managed the debt quietly and kept the illusion alive. But the moment he passed away, that safety net was completely removed. I looked at my father, whose face was now the color of wet ash. I told him that he did not inherit a billion-dollar real estate empire. He inherited a functionally bankrupt shell company that was currently in default on $15 million worth of corporate debt. Richard violently shook his head, refusing to process the reality of the situation. He stammered that the corporate structure did not matter, that he was the rightful blood heir, and that he would simply sue Apex Holdings and tie them up in federal court for the next decade. He arrogantly stated that whoever this cowardly hidden chief executive officer of Apex was, they were going to have to face him and his lawyers in front of a judge. Desmond cleared his throat, a sharp sound that cut through Richard's rambling. Desmond directed Richard to look at page 1 of the incorporation documents sitting in the binder. Richard's trembling hands flipped the heavy paper over. His eyes frantically scanned the black ink. His breath hitched loudly in his throat. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, invading his space. I told him he would not have to look very far or hire any lawyers to find the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. I told him Grandpa Winston had made me the chief executive officer and the 80% majority shareholder of the parent company 5 years ago. The absolute devastation in the room was palpable. The minority shareholders began whispering among themselves, realizing the absolute genius of Winston's final move to protect his legacy from his incompetent son. They immediately started distancing themselves from Richard, physically sliding their heavy leather chairs back from the table. Richard collapsed into the nearest empty seat, his chest heaving rapidly, as if all the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the room. He looked at me not with the arrogant disdain he had shown at the funeral, nor the anger he had shown at the press conference, but with pure, unadulterated terror. He finally realized that the daughter he had kicked out into the freezing rain was the sole owner of the roof over his head. I did not feel an ounce of pity for the man sitting beside me. I told him that the grace period was over. I announced to the room that I was officially executing the debt collection clause and initiating a total asset forfeiture of the subsidiary. The empire he thought he owned was gone, and I was taking back every single thing that belonged to me. The look of sheer panic on my father's face in that boardroom was the beautiful culmination of a collapse that had actually begun days earlier. To truly understand how they reached that point of absolute ruin, we have to look back at the exact moment their toxic alliance first began to crumble. The true destruction did not start in the corporate office. It started in the immediate aftermath of the country club humiliation, on the night the bank cards were declined in front of the city elite. Back at the family mansion, the atmosphere was suffocating. The heavy mahogany front doors slammed shut, echoing violently through the cavernous marble foyer. Richard tore off his custom Italian tie and threw it onto the floor, his chest heaving with manufactured outrage. Trent was pacing frantically back and forth across the expensive Persian rug, his earlier arrogance having completely evaporated into thin air. Simone stood by the grand stone fireplace, her arms tightly crossed, glaring at both of them with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Richard immediately grabbed the house phone and dialed the private emergency line for the bank wealth management division. He paced the length of the living room, screaming at the automated system, demanding to speak to a senior executive right that second. He was convinced that I had somehow hacked into their accounts. He believed it was a temporary glitch, a petty act of revenge that he could fix with a single threatening phone call. When he finally got a human being on the line, a senior account manager named Gregory, the conversation only made things infinitely worse. Richard barked his demands into the receiver, ordering Gregory to lift the security freeze and authorize the $40,000 country club payment immediately. He threatened to move all his assets to a competing bank by morning if his demands were not met. Gregory remained completely calm and strictly professional. He patiently explained to my father that the bank had not made an error. The corporate accounts were legally restricted due to a severe subsidiary debt default. Richard stopped pacing. He gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He demanded to know what subsidiary Gregory was talking about. Richard insisted that he owned the parent company, the main family enterprise. Gregory pulled up the federal filings and read them aloud. He stated that according to the updated corporate registry, the family firm was legally classified as a subsidiary of a private trust called Apex Holdings. Due to a massive outstanding debt, the parent company had enacted a legal emergency asset freeze to prevent further capital drain. Richard dropped the phone. The heavy plastic receiver clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. Trent stopped his frantic pacing and asked his father what the bank had said. Simone, who had been listening to the entire one-sided conversation, realized her access to millions of dollars had just been cut off in the blink of an eye. The glamorous lifestyle she had secured through marriage was suddenly vaporizing. She turned her fury entirely on her husband. Simone stepped away from the fireplace and walked straight up to Trent. She asked him how he could possibly accept the title of chief executive officer and not even know that his own company was a subsidiary. She began verbally shredding his competence right there in the living room. She mocked his fake millionaire status, pointing out that every single thing he owned, from his designer suits to his imported cars, was suddenly completely worthless if the accounts were legally frozen. She reminded him that the massive check he wrote for the luxury yacht earlier that day was going to bounce by tomorrow afternoon. Trent shrank back, suddenly terrified of his wife. He desperately tried to defend himself, stammering that Grandpa Winston had never once mentioned a parent company. He tried to push the blame onto my father, loudly claiming Richard should have known all about the hidden corporate structure before publicly handing over the leadership title. Richard immediately fired back with venom, loudly calling Trent an ungrateful, lazy idiot who should have read the financial ledgers instead of playing golf all week. The ugly blame game was in full swing. They were like cornered rats, violently turning on each other the second the sinking ship started taking on water. Simone laughed bitterly. She told them both that they were pathetic. She realized that she had tied herself to a sinking anchor. She looked at Trent and asked him what his plan was to pay for the yacht. Trent had absolutely no answer. He was terrified of facing federal wire fraud charges if the $2 million check bounced and the boat broker decided to press charges. He started rambling about taking out a personal loan, but Simone quickly reminded him that his personal trust fund was directly tied to the frozen company accounts. He had zero liquidity. He had absolutely nothing. The cold reality of their hopeless situation hung heavily in the freezing room. They had absolutely no cash, they had massive impending federal debts, and their pristine reputation among the city elite investors was currently in tatters. They desperately needed liquid capital, and they needed it immediately, before the morning papers caught wind of the bounced checks. They were so desperate to save face and cover the yacht contract that they were completely blind to the larger fatal trap closing tightly around them. The pure panic filling that living room was the exact psychological catalyst that drove them to make their most catastrophic mistake the very next day. It was the precise moment they decided they had to secretly sell Grandpa Winston's most valuable downtown commercial property just to survive the week. They foolishly thought they were being clever and highly strategic, but they were actually walking right into my fully prepared financial slaughterhouse. The morning sun brought no relief to the suffocating tension inside the family mansion. The false bravado that Richard and Trent had paraded around just 24 hours earlier had completely evaporated, replaced by a frantic clawing desperation. They were trapped in a financial vice of their own making, and the walls were rapidly closing in. Trent was pacing the length of the marble kitchen, his phone pressed tightly to his ear as he desperately tried to reach the luxury yacht broker. He was leaving frantic voicemails trying to invent ridiculous excuses to delay the deposit processing. He knew that the moment the broker attempted to clear that $2 million check, the bank would flag it. Trent was terrified. In the corporate world, writing a multi-million-dollar check from a frozen account is not just an embarrassing mistake. It is a direct ticket to a federal wire fraud investigation. He pictured himself in a courtroom stripped of his designer suits, facing severe prison time because he had wanted to play the role of a billionaire playboy. Richard was in an equally pathetic state. He sat at the massive kitchen island nursing a black coffee, his eyes bloodshot from a completely sleepless night. His pristine country club reputation was everything to him. The thought of his wealthy golfing buddies finding out he was broke, the sheer humiliation of being exposed as a fraud, physically nauseated him. He had spent his entire adult life riding on my grandfather's coattails, pretending to be a brilliant financial mind. Now, without Grandpa Winston there to quietly clean up the messes, Richard was paralyzed. They needed liquid cash immediately. They could not apply for a corporate loan because the subsidiary default status would instantly red flag any underwriter. They could not liquidate stocks because the portfolios were tied to the locked parent accounts. They were entirely boxed in. It was in this moment of pure blinding panic that Richard made the most fatal decision of his life. He looked up from his coffee mug and brought up the downtown tech district property. This was not just any piece of real estate. It was Grandpa Winston's masterpiece. 20 years ago, Winston had quietly purchased a massive undeveloped commercial plot right in the center of what was then a neglected industrial zone. He knew the city was going to expand, and he had patiently held on to that dirt for 2 decades. He always refused to sell it, constantly telling me that once the city rezoned the area for high-rise commercial development, that plot would be worth tens of millions. It was the crown jewel of his portfolio, meant to be the foundation of the family's wealth for the next generation. But Richard and Trent did not care about the next generation. They did not care about legacy, patience, or strategic growth. They only cared about surviving the week. Richard reasoned that since the property was wholly owned outright with no active mortgages, it was the only major asset not heavily monitored by the bank's automated compliance algorithms. They could sell it, take the cash cover, the yacht check, unfreeze the accounts by paying down a fraction of the subsidiary debt, and pretend none of this ever happened. The problem was time. Standard commercial real estate transactions take months. You need environmental studies, zoning audits, board approvals, and extensive due diligence. Richard and Trent did not have months. They had less than 24 hours before the yacht broker went to the bank. That was when Simone stepped into the kitchen. She had been quietly listening to their frantic plotting. Simone was a licensed real estate broker before she married Trent, and she maintained deep connections in the underground private luxury market. These were the shadow brokers who dealt in quiet off-market transactions for high-net-worth individuals who needed to move money fast and discreetly. Simone saw an opportunity to salvage the situation and secure her own lifestyle before the ship completely sank. She pulled out her phone and told them she knew a private broker who represented anonymous holding companies looking for distressed assets. Simone made the call, pacing the length of the kitchen while speaking in hushed, urgent tones. What she did not know, and what Richard and Trent could never have guessed, was that the specific private broker she reached out to had been heavily vetted and quietly placed in her professional orbit by Desmond months ago. It was a meticulously planted seed just waiting to be watered by their desperation. 10 minutes later, Simone ended the call and turned to face her husband and father-in-law. She delivered the news with a cold, business-like detachment. She told them her contact had a private, anonymous buyer willing to execute a blind purchase. The buyer would wire the full amount in cash within 24 hours. There would be no environmental audits, no corporate board reviews, and no questions asked. The closing could happen the very next day at a neutral title company. Richard let out a massive sigh of relief, thinking they were saved. But then Simone dropped the hammer. She explained that because of the incredibly tight turnaround and the complete lack of standard due diligence, the anonymous buyer was demanding a massive discount. They would only pay 60 cents on the dollar. It was a brutal 40% loss off the current assessed market value of the land. Richard physically recoiled. He was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. He knew selling Winston's masterpiece at a 40% loss was financial suicide. It was throwing away millions of dollars of guaranteed future equity. He started to argue, shaking his head, saying they could not possibly take a hit that massive on the company's balance sheet. But Trent immediately stepped in, completely blinded by his own fear of going to jail. He pressured Richard relentlessly. Trent slammed his hands on the kitchen island, yelling that a balance sheet did not matter if he was sitting in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud. He aggressively argued that it was just an empty plot of dirt, and that once they had cash flowing again, they could invest in something better. He manipulated Richard's fear of public humiliation, reminding his father that if the account stayed frozen, the country club would publicly revoke his membership by Friday. The thought of being publicly stripped of his elite status broke Richard's final remaining shred of logic. His shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked at Simone and told her to draft the preliminary agreement. He gave the absolute green light to sell off his father's greatest legacy for pennies on the dollar. They all breathed a collective sigh of relief, genuinely believing they had masterminded a brilliant escape from a temporary cash flow problem. They celebrated their quick thinking, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just enthusiastically stepped directly into the final inescapable jaws of my trap. The very next afternoon, that trap snapped shut inside a sterile conference room at a boutique title company downtown. The room smelled of fresh ink and cheap coffee, a sharp contrast to the luxurious mahogany offices Richard and Trent were accustomed to. But they did not care about the aesthetics today. They only cared about the wire transfer. Simone sat at the head of the heavy glass table, her posture perfectly straight, wearing a triumphant smirk. She had completely taken over the operation. She was no longer just the beautiful wife of the golden child. In her mind, she was the brilliant savior of the family empire. She tapped her manicured nails against the glass, loudly boasting to Richard about how her exclusive underground network had pulled off a miracle. She reminded him repeatedly that without her swift action he would be publicly humiliated by the end of the week. Richard, swallowing his pride, nodded along. He looked exhausted, his usual polished demeanor replaced by the twitchy impatience of a man narrowly avoiding the gallows. Trent sat beside him, nervously bouncing his leg. He kept checking his expensive watch, calculating exactly how many hours he had left before the yacht broker deposited the fraudulent check. The tension in the room was suffocating, driven entirely by their desperate need for cash. At exactly 2 o'clock, the heavy glass door of the conference room swung open. The representative for the anonymous buyer stepped inside. It was Desmond. He walked in with his signature quiet authority, carrying his titanium briefcase. Now, any competent executive would have instantly recognized the man who had served as their father's most trusted corporate counsel for over a decade. Any competent CEO would have paused, questioned why Winston's secretive lawyer was suddenly representing an anonymous buyer, and immediately halted the transaction. But Richard and Trent were not competent. They were entirely blinded by panic. Richard barely glanced up from his phone, giving Desmond a dismissive nod, assuming he was just another high-priced legal courier sent to push the paperwork across the finish line. Trent did not even look at him. He just aggressively demanded to know if the wire transfer was locked and ready to go. Simone, eager to play the dominant executive, leaned forward and coldly instructed Desmond to skip the pleasantries and just hand over the signature pages. Desmond did not smile. He did not introduce himself. He simply placed his briefcase on the table, the click echoing loudly. He extracted the closing documents and slid them across the glass. This was the moment of truth. In commercial real estate, the fine print is everything. The holding company name, the liability clauses, the exact transfer of equity, all of it was spelled out in stark black ink on page 42. A real businessman would have brought his own legal team to review every single syllable before putting pen to paper. But Richard grabbed the solid gold pen from his jacket pocket without hesitation. He did not read the first page. He did not read the second page. He frantically flipped straight to the back, his eyes searching only for the highlighted signature lines. Trent leaned over his shoulder urgently, whispering for him to just sign it so they could get the bank confirmation numbers. Richard scribbled his name across the bottom of the contract, legally signing away Grandpa Winston's most valuable asset, the crown jewel of the family legacy. He pushed the paper toward Trent, who eagerly signed as acting CEO. Simone watched them with absolute satisfaction, genuinely believing she had just secured her luxurious future. They pushed the executed documents back to Desmond, demanding their copy of the wire transfer receipt. Desmond calmly reviewed the signatures. He checked the corporate seals. Once satisfied the legal execution was flawless and irreversible, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was the banking confirmation. He slid it across the table. Trent snatched it up like a starving animal, his eyes widening with relief as he saw the massive cash deposit currently pending in their subsidiary account. Richard let out a loud, heavy breath, leaning back in his chair and running a hand over his face. He actually smiled. He looked at Simone and thanked her, declaring that the crisis was officially over. Desmond neatly packed the signed contracts back into his briefcase, offered a stiff, formal nod, and walked out of the conference room without saying a single word. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in the back of my town car, parked discreetly in the alley behind the title company. The rear door opened, and Desmond slid into the seat beside me. He opened his briefcase and handed me the freshly signed deed. I looked down at my father's frantic, rushed signature. I traced the ink with my finger, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. They had absolutely no idea what they had just done. Because they were too arrogant to read the fine print, they never saw the name of the purchasing entity. They never saw that the anonymous buyer they were so desperate to sell to was actually Apex Holdings. They had just sold Grandpa Winston's masterpiece right back to my holding company. And simply because they were terrified of the bouncing yacht check, They sold it to me at a staggering 40% discount. They had practically handed me millions of dollars of instant liquid equity. Upstairs, Richard and Trent were probably celebrating, genuinely believing they had outsmarted the system. They thought the cash injection would save their pristine reputations and keep the bank off their backs. They did not realize that the money they just received was merely a temporary band-aid on a fatal wound. I finally had the prized land. I now had all the power, and I was about to let them enjoy their false victory for exactly 24 hours before I brought their entire world crashing down. The morning after the wire transfer cleared the atmosphere inside the corporate headquarters underwent a miraculous transformation. The suffocating dread that paralyzed Richard and Trent was instantly replaced by toxic arrogance. Trent danced into the executive suite. He wired the $2 million to his boat broker, avoiding federal fraud charges and securing his yacht. He spent the morning loudly bragging to the remaining staff about his brilliant negotiation skills, ignoring the fact that he had just sold off our grandfather's most valuable asset at a catastrophic 40% loss. Richard was in an equally euphoric state. The sudden influx of cash into their subsidiary account made him feel invincible. He believed he had outsmarted the bank, the market, and me. But surviving the week was not enough for his massive ego. He wanted absolute revenge for the humiliation at the country club. He wanted to completely rewrite the narrative, secure Trent's position as the undisputed heir, and permanently erase my name from the family legacy. He ordered his public relations team to immediately organize the largest press conference the company had ever hosted. Richard demanded the grand ballroom at the historic Drake Hotel. He invited every major financial journalist and local television news anchor in Chicago. He told his publicists the official purpose of the event was to announce a massive luxury commercial development right in the heart of the city. It was a complete lie. They did not have the capital, the zoning permits, or the architectural plans for any such development. The cash they received from my holding company barely covered their immediate outstanding debts and Trent's reckless spending. But Richard understood that perception is often more powerful than reality in the corporate world. If he projected absolute strength, he believed the elite investors would flock back to him. However, the fake development was only the bait. His true objective for calling the media was character assassination. He spent the evening rehearsing a speech designed to publicly destroy my reputation. He knew that I was a highly respected mergers and acquisitions director. He knew my entire career relied on absolute trust and ethical integrity. By publicly accusing me of financial crimes, he intended to make me completely unemployable in the financial sector. By 10 o'clock the next morning, the grand ballroom was packed. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm, expensive glow over the rows of seated journalists. A massive blue banner bearing the family company logo hung proudly behind the elevated stage. The heavy wooden double doors at the back of the room swung open, and Richard walked in. He looked like the perfect distinguished patriarch. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly swept back, projecting an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. Trent walked proudly right behind him, trying to look like a seasoned visionary executive rather than a man who spent his afternoons day drinking. Simone flanked Trent wearing a pristine white designer dress and a stunning new diamond necklace she had undoubtedly purchased that very morning to celebrate their supposed financial rescue. They walked down the center aisle, smiling and waving at the cameras like corporate royalty. The reporters immediately stood up, camera flashes going off in a blinding strobe light effect as the trio confidently took their places on the stage behind the polished mahogany podium. Richard stepped up to the microphone, gripping the edges of the podium with a practiced, confident ease. He began his speech with a smooth, charismatic welcome, thanking the press for attending on such short notice. He spoke passionately about Grandpa Winston, honoring his legacy and painting a beautiful picture of a family united in grief, but determined to push forward. Then he seamlessly transitioned into his grand illusion. He proudly announced that the family firm was officially entering a bold new era of unprecedented expansion under Trent's leadership. He detailed a fabricated $500 million luxury high-rise project, claiming they had secured the land and initial funding. He threw out impressive architectural buzzwords and projected massive profit margins for the upcoming fiscal year. The journalists scribbled furiously in their notepads. The financial bloggers typed rapidly. Nobody questioned the logistics. Nobody asked to see the permits or deeds. Richard delivered the massive lie with such absolute conviction that the entire room swallowed it whole. Trent stood right behind him, puffing out his chest and nodding solemnly, soaking in the admiration of the press pool. Simone offered the flashing cameras a warm, supportive smile, playing the role of the devoted, loving executive wife to absolute perfection. Richard's expression suddenly shifted. His confident voice melted into the somber tone of a heartbroken father. He lowered his head and told the room that with new leadership comes the painful task of addressing internal betrayals. He took a deep breath, perfectly simulating a man struggling to hold back tears. He announced that he had been forced to officially disown me. The room fell dead silent. He looked up, his eyes shining with fake sorrow, and claimed that I had used my background in private equity to quietly embezzle millions of dollars from Grandpa Winston's charitable foundation during his final vulnerable months. He painted me as a greedy, jealous daughter who could not stand the fact that Trent was chosen to lead the company. He spun a horrific tale claiming I had forged documents to steal the company while they were mourning. The reporters gasped. Camera shutters clicked frantically to capture the fake tears rolling down Richard's cheeks. He played the ultimate victim, a loving father devastated by a monstrous corporate vulture of a daughter. He promised the press that the family would recover from my terrible betrayal. The journalists were completely mesmerized. They were eating up every single word, already drafting the scandalous headlines that would ruin my life. They had absolutely no idea that I was standing right outside the ballroom doors holding the exact legal documents that would turn this press conference into his public execution. I pushed the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom open with a resounding thud that echoed over my father's manufactured sniffling. The sound instantly drew the attention of the camera crews stationed at the back of the room. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the dense crowd of journalists as I walked directly down the center aisle. I wore a striking crimson suit that contrasted sharply with the sea of dark blazers worn by the press pool. I did not look like a disgraced, embezzling daughter returning to beg for forgiveness. I looked like an executioner arriving to carry out a sentence. Up on the brightly lit stage, Richard froze. His perfectly rehearsed performance shattered in an instant. The fake tears glistening on his cheeks seemed to evaporate. He gripped the edges of the mahogany podium so hard his knuckles turned completely white. Trent took a nervous step backward, bumping into the promotional banner behind him, his arrogant posture instantly deflating. Simone simply stared, her perfectly manicured hand drifting up to touch the new diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, as a sudden wave of apprehension washed over her face. They were trapped under the blinding stage lights, unable to run, unable to hide from the audience they had so eagerly summoned to witness my destruction. I did not walk up to the stage. I stopped at the front row of the press seating directly in front of Helen, the senior financial reporter for the Chicago Tribune. She was a highly respected veteran journalist known for her ruthless investigative pieces and her absolute intolerance for corporate nonsense. I unlatched the sleek black leather briefcase I was carrying and pulled out a thick, heavy binder. It was not a printed manifesto or a list of petty family grievances. It was a fully certified, federally stamped financial audit of the family subsidiary. I placed it directly into Helen's hands. I pulled out exactly a dozen more identical binders and quickly distributed them to the lead anchors and financial bloggers in the first two rows. Helen immediately flipped the heavy cover open. Her eyes, magnified behind her thick glasses, scanned the executive summary on the first page. I watched her posture change. The polite skepticism of a reporter listening to a standard public relations pitch vanished, replaced by the sharp, predatory focus of a journalist who has just been handed the scoop of the decade. Her jaw physically dropped as she processed the devastating numbers. I stepped over to an empty microphone stand set up right in the aisle for the question and answer session. I leaned in, my voice calm, steady, and amplified across the entire silent ballroom. I thanked Richard for the fascinating piece of creative fiction. I then instructed every journalist holding a binder to turn to page 4. The sound of rustling paper filled the massive room like a sudden gust of wind. I kept my eyes locked on my father as I translated the complex corporate data into a brutal, undeniable reality for the entire press pool. I announced loudly that the legendary family real estate firm Richard was boasting about was no longer an independent, self-sustaining empire. I revealed that 5 years ago, Grandpa Winston had legally restructured the entire business, downgrading it into a mere subsidiary of a private trust called Apex Holdings. I paused, letting the words sink in before instructing the reporters to look at the debt schedule on page 6. I explained that the company Trent was supposedly leading into a $500 million expansion was actually a hollow shell, currently operating with a massive $15 million deficit owed directly to its parent entity. The sudden silence in the massive ballroom broke like shattered glass. Total chaos erupted. Dozens of hands shot into the air. The camera flashes became a blinding, continuous strobe light, completely overwhelming the stage. Helen from the Tribune was the first to shout over the noise. She did not raise her hand. She stood up, waving the audit in the air, and aggressively asked Richard how he planned to fund a luxury high-rise project when his bank accounts had been frozen for subsidiary debt default just 48 hours ago. The live broadcast cameras instantly zoomed in on my father's face. He looked exactly like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. His face turned a deep, unhealthy shade of purple. He leaned into the podium microphone and began stammering uncontrollably. He tried to claim the documents were forged. He threatened to sue the journalists for defamation if they printed a single word. But his threats were completely empty, and the reporters knew it. The documents in their hands were authenticated with federal routing numbers, watermarks, and registered corporate seals that simply could not be faked. Trent made the entire situation infinitely worse. Panicking under the flashing lights, he forgot his lapel microphone was still hot. His voice echoed through the ballroom speakers as he frantically turned to my father and asked what Apex Holdings was and why they owed them $15 million. A collective gasp followed by vicious murmurs rippled through the press pool. The newly crowned chief executive officer had just admitted on live television that he had absolutely no idea his own company was in catastrophic debt to a parent organization. Simone's warm smile melted into pure terror. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. She realized their new cash was a temporary illusion. The reporters were no longer interested in the fabricated embezzlement story. They surged forward, shouting questions about insolvency and fraud. Richard tore the microphone from the podium, desperately gesturing to cut the audio feed. But the catastrophic damage was already done. The live broadcast captured every second of their complete meltdown, exposing them as absolute frauds. I stepped away from the microphone stand, turned my back on the stage, and walked out of the ballroom, leaving them all to slowly burn. As the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung shut behind me, the muffled sound of shouting journalists was the only music I needed. I stepped into the quiet luxury of the hotel corridor and did not look back. Back inside that room, the survival instincts of the woman who had married my brother for his crown were violently kicking into high gear. Simone did not stay to comfort her husband. While Trent was stammering into a dead microphone and Richard was physically trying to shield his face from the flashing cameras, Simone quietly slipped off the edge of the stage. She blended into the chaotic crowd of frantic reporters, keeping her head down, and exited through the rear service kitchen doors. She was a fiercely pragmatic woman. She knew a sinking ship when she saw one, and she had absolutely no intention of going down with the captain. Simone hailed a cab outside the hotel and immediately began making urgent phone calls. She did not call her friends to complain, and she certainly did not call Trent to offer emotional support. She called a highly discreet, ruthlessly efficient private investigator she had used years ago to vet potential business partners. She offered him triple his usual hourly rate for an immediate, comprehensive digital sweep of my brother's personal finances. She needed to know exactly how deep the financial rot extended. She needed to know if Trent possessed any hidden offshore accounts, private trusts, or untouchable assets that were legally separated from the catastrophic mess I had just exposed on live television. She arrived back at the luxury penthouse an hour later. The massive apartment with its panoramic views of the Chicago skyline suddenly felt less like a palace and more like a beautifully decorated federal prison cell. She poured herself a glass of expensive wine, her hands trembling slightly, and waited for the investigator to call back. She paced the length of the marble living room, her mind racing through emergency exit strategies. She had spent 5 years tolerating Trent's unbearable arrogance, his laziness, and his constant need for validation entirely because she believed she was securing a lifetime of generational wealth. The phone rang. Simone snatched it off the marble counter. The investigator did not waste time with pleasantries. He delivered the financial autopsy with cold clinical precision. He told her that Trent was functionally broke. The investigator explained that Trent's personal trust fund, the one he constantly bragged about at dinner parties, was legally anchored to the family company's primary credit line. Because the parent entity, Apex Holdings, had enacted a complete asset freeze due to the subsidiary debt default, Trent's trust was completely inaccessible. But the nightmare did not stop there. The investigator revealed that the penthouse they were currently standing in was not paid off. Trent had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage against it to cover his previous failed commercial development projects. Even his checking accounts were currently overdrawn due to the massive wire transfer he forced through for the luxury yacht. Simone dropped the phone onto the sofa. The air was completely sucked out of the room. She realized with absolute clarity that Trent was nothing but a fake millionaire. He was a man playing dress-up with his grandfather's credit cards. He had absolutely no liquid assets, no emergency reserves, and massive looming federal liabilities. She was legally chained to a man who possessed a negative net worth and a rapidly approaching public scandal. She immediately marched into their bedroom, pulled out her designer suitcases, and began furiously packing only the items she purchased with her own money. 2 hours later, the front door of the penthouse unlocked. Trent walked in looking like a man who had just survived a massive car crash. His designer suit was deeply wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. His silk tie was undone and his eyes were wild with pure panic. He immediately started rambling, pacing the hardwood floor, cursing my name, and frantically trying to convince Simone that they could hire a team of elite lawyers to sue me for corporate defamation. He was completely delusional, still clinging desperately to the belief that he possessed some kind of inherent power. Simone did not say a single word at first. She simply stood in the doorway of their massive walk-in closet, holding a completely packed designer suitcase. Trent stopped his frantic pacing and stared at the heavy luggage. He asked her what she was doing, his voice cracking with a mixture of confusion and rising terror. Simone stepped out of the closet. She looked at him not with anger but with absolute chilling disdain. She told him she had just spoken to a private investigator. She watched the remaining color completely drain from Trent's face as she systematically listed every single one of his financial failures. She threw the harsh reality of the hidden second mortgage right in his face. She mocked his permanently frozen trust fund. She asked him how exactly he planned to pay for the elite corporate lawyers he was babbling about when he could not afford to buy basic groceries. Trent tried to grab her arm desperately, begging her to listen to him. Simone slapped his hand away with vicious force. She verbally shredded his fragile ego into tiny pieces. She told him he was the most pathetic excuse for a man she had ever encountered. She pointed out that he had spent his entire life looking down on people who actually worked, while he secretly leeched off a company he did not even own. She called him a complete fraud, a spineless coward, and a massive financial liability. Trent started crying. The golden child broke down sobbing in the middle of his living room. He begged her not to leave him alone to face the vicious media cycle. She calmly adjusted her heavy designer bag, turned her back on his pathetic tears, and walked out the front door forever. While Trent was left sobbing alone in his mortgaged penthouse, the morning sun rose over the Chicago financial district, bringing an apocalyptic reality to the family company headquarters. The moment Richard pushed through the revolving glass doors of the lobby, he knew his empire had completely collapsed. The receptionist, a loyal woman, was packing her personal items into a cardboard box. She did not even look up or offer a polite greeting when my father walked in through the glass doors. Sitting squarely in the center of the polished reception desk was a massive mountain of certified mail. Richard grabbed the stack of envelopes. His hands trembled as he tore open the first thick packet. It was an official foreclosure notice. He frantically tore through the rest of the pile, finding formal bankruptcy threats and immediate cease and desist orders. The sleek legal letterhead of Apex Holdings was stamped on every single page in bold black ink. The $15 million debt was no longer just a scandalous secret revealed at a chaotic press conference. It was a legally enforced collection action that had officially commenced overnight. Breathing heavily, Richard practically ran to the private executive elevator. He hammered the call button. When the steel doors finally slid open on the penthouse floor, he stepped into a war zone. The private contractors were completely gone. They had seen the disastrous live broadcast the night before and immediately abandoned the job, knowing their expensive invoices would never be paid. They left behind torn drywall, exposed electrical wires, and drop cloths scattered across the expensive carpet. My grandfather's office had been reduced to a literal construction site. Richard stumbled into his partially demolished corner office and collapsed into his leather chair. The phone on his desk began to ring incessantly. The caller ID flashed names of angry vendors, panicked corporate creditors, and aggressive journalists. He violently yanked the phone cord out of the wall, plunging the room into a suffocating silence. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and called Trent. He needed his supposed chief executive officer to step up and help him manage the crisis. Trent answered. His voice was completely hollow. He babbled uncontrollably about how Simone had packed her designer bags and left him. He cried that his personal trust fund was frozen and that the bank was already calling about the second mortgage on his penthouse. Richard listened for exactly 10 seconds before a wave of pure disgust washed over him. He yelled into the receiver, calling Trent a useless, pathetic liability who had ruined the family name. Richard ended the call, throwing his cell phone across the room. He realized in that exact second that he was entirely on his own without a safety net. Despite staring at complete ruin, Richard's massive ego refused to accept defeat. He convinced himself there had to be a loophole, a temporary fix to buy him time to maneuver. He realized he needed capital. He needed massive, immediate liquid capital to pay down a fraction of the debt and lift the emergency asset freeze. He walked over to the corporate directory and focused his desperate eyes on the list of minority shareholders. They were silent partners, men who had trusted Grandpa Winston implicitly for decades. He marched back to the front desk and ordered his terrified secretary to summon every minority shareholder. He demanded their presence for a mandatory board meeting at 1 o'clock. He instructed her to frame the meeting as a highly confidential strategy session to combat a hostile corporate takeover. He spent the next 3 hours frantically pacing his ruined office. He practiced his delivery in front of a cracked mirror, wiping the nervous sweat from his forehead. He planned to frame me as a rogue, vengeful daughter who had manipulated an elderly man into signing over the company. He genuinely believed that if he played the victim well enough, these wealthy men would open their checkbooks to protect their own minor investments. At 12:45, Richard walked into the main executive boardroom. He arranged legal pads and poured himself a glass of water. His hands were shaking so violently that he spilled water all over the polished mahogany table. Shortly after the minority shareholders began to arrive, they walked into the room with grim, stony expressions. Not a single one of them offered to shake Richard's hand. They took their seats in absolute silence. They had all read the morning financial papers. They had all analyzed the verified financial audits I handed out to the press. Richard stood at the head of the table. He cleared his throat, forcing a confident smile that looked completely deranged under the circumstances. He began his desperate plea. He admitted to a temporary liquidity crisis, but assured them the company still held massive underlying value. He literally begged them to inject emergency capital, promising astronomical returns once the hostile entity known as Apex Holdings was defeated in federal court. He spoke faster and faster, his voice rising in pitch, sweating through his expensive shirt. He told them it was their financial duty to protect Grandpa Winston's legacy from a greedy, estranged family member. The minority shareholders simply sat in their heavy leather chairs and stared silently at him. They looked at him not as a visionary leader, but as a highly dangerous liability. One of the senior shareholders, an older gentleman named Jonathan, leaned forward. He asked Richard a simple, devastating question. He asked how Richard planned to fight a legally binding 5-year-old corporate trust agreement without a single dollar to pay for legal representation. Richard stammered, completely unable to answer. He desperately begged them to just trust his grand vision. The desperation in his voice echoed off the boardroom walls. He was a broken, terrified man, clinging to the edge of a cliff, desperately trying to drag 6 other men down with him, completely unaware that the final blow was already walking down the hallway. I timed my entrance perfectly. The heavy double doors of the boardroom did not just open. They burst inward with a resounding crash that made every single man in the room physically jump. I walked in, flanked by Desmond on my right, and 4 of the most ruthless, highly paid corporate litigators in Chicago spread out behind me in a terrifying V formation. The sheer energy of our entrance completely suffocated Richard's pathetic begging. Trent, who had been sulking in the corner of the room trying to look invisible, suddenly decided this was the moment to assert his non-existent authority. He jumped up from his chair, his face red with a mixture of fear and forced outrage. He pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed at the top of his lungs, ordering the 2 massive security guards stationed near the door to arrest me for trespassing. He yelled that I was a disgraced former employee and a corporate spy. The 2 guardsmen who had worked for the family for years did not flinch. They did not reach for their radios. They simply crossed their arms and stared blankly ahead. Trent's voice cracked as he screamed at them again, threatening to fire them on the spot, completely forgetting that he could not even afford to buy his own groceries right now. I did not stop walking. The click of my heels against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the room besides Trent's frantic breathing. I stopped halfway down the massive mahogany table and looked directly at my brother. I calmly informed him that he could not fire the security team because they no longer worked for him. I told him I had personally renegotiated the entire building's security contract at 8 o'clock that morning through my holding company. They answered exclusively to me now. I suggested he sit back down before they physically removed him for disturbing my meeting. Trent's jaw dropped. The last tiny shred of his false bravado evaporated instantly. He practically fell backward into his leather chair, his eyes darting frantically between me, the impassive guards, and his father. I continued my walk down the length of the table. The minority shareholders watched me with a mixture of absolute shock and dawning realization. These were powerful, wealthy men who did not take kindly to being lied to. They had just listened to Richard practically cry for their money, and now they were watching a hostile takeover happen in real time. Richard was frozen at the head of the table. He was still gripping his legal pad, his knuckles completely white. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a massive, unstoppable train. I walked right up to him. I did not ask him to move. I did not raise my voice. I simply stared at him, my expression completely void of any daughterly affection or basic human sympathy. The sheer weight of his own absolute powerlessness finally crushed his arrogance. Without a word, he slowly backed away, abandoning the massive leather chair that had belonged to my grandfather. I took the seat at the head of the table. It felt right. It felt earned. Desmond immediately stepped forward, snapping open his titanium briefcase. The sharp click echoed loudly in the tense silence. He began sliding thick, legally certified binders down the polished mahogany table, making sure every minority shareholder received a copy. The litigators fanned out, standing strategically behind me, presenting a unified, terrifying wall of legal power. I folded my hands on the table and looked at the men who had helped build this subsidiary. I told them I knew exactly why Richard had called them here today. I knew he had begged them for a massive capital injection. I knew he had lied to them about the financial health of the company, and I knew he had tried to frame me as a rogue, vengeful daughter. I let my words sink in, watching the shareholders flip open the binders. I warned them that throwing their wealth into this subsidiary would be exactly like burning it in an incinerator. Richard finally found his voice. He slammed his hand against the wall, his face flushed with panicked rage. He yelled that I was lying, accusing me of corporate sabotage and demanding the shareholders ignore the documents. He sounded like a madman. Jonathan, the senior shareholder, who had known my grandfather the longest, did not look at Richard. He did not even flinch at the yelling. He looked directly at me over his reading glasses. He raised his hand, silencing Richard with a single authoritative gesture. Jonathan stated that he had read the morning papers. He had seen the press conference footage. He told Richard to shut up and sit down because he wanted to hear exactly what I had to say. Richard practically collapsed into an empty chair against the wall. The room was mine. The floor was mine. I opened my own binder not because I needed to read it, but to symbolize the start of the final execution. The ambush was complete. I had physically taken the throne, neutralized their security, and secured the undivided attention of the only men left who possessed any actual money. Now it was time to drop the logic bomb that would permanently obliterate their entire reality. I looked at my father, a broken, sweating mess of a man, and prepared to deliver the ultimate truth. I opened my binder and looked directly at the minority shareholders, entirely ignoring my father and brother for a moment. I told them that the entire premise of Richard's emergency board meeting was based on a fundamental catastrophic misunderstanding of corporate law. Richard had stood before them and claimed that Grandpa Winston tragically passed away without leaving a will. He claimed this was an oversight of an elderly man. I leaned forward and corrected that assumption. I stated clearly that Winston did not forget to write a will. He simply did not need one. By the time he passed away, Winston possessed absolutely zero personal assets to distribute. He had already given everything away. Richard let out a hollow, confused scoff from his chair against the wall. He demanded to know what I was talking about, insisting that the family firm was worth hundreds of millions. I slowly turned my gaze to him. I told him the family firm used to be worth hundreds of millions right up until 5 years ago. I then shifted my attention to Trent, who was suddenly looking incredibly pale and physically shrinking into his leather seat. I announced to the room that exactly 5 years and 2 months ago, Grandpa Winston initiated a routine internal audit on the Commercial Development Division. That division was being managed by Trent. I watched Trent swallow hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. I revealed the ugly truth that Richard had been completely blind to. The audit uncovered a massive systematic embezzlement operation. Trent had quietly siphoned nearly $1.5 million out of the Corporate Development Fund. He did not steal the money to invest or build. He stole it to cover a mountain of hidden illegal gambling debts he had racked up with underground bookies. The boardroom erupted in shocked murmurs. The minority shareholders glared at Trent with pure, unadulterated disgust. Richard's jaw went completely slack. He looked at his golden child, the son he had just crowned chief executive officer, and the realization of Trent's absolute betrayal finally hit him. Trent tried to shake his head weakly, muttering that it was a lie, but his terrified body language screamed guilt. I raised my voice slightly to cut through the murmurs. I explained that Grandpa Winston was faced with a terrible choice. He could have called the federal authorities, handed over the audit, and sent his only grandson to federal prison for corporate fraud. But Winston was a proud man. He refused to let the family name be dragged through the mud in a highly publicized criminal trial. He refused to let the media destroy the legacy he had built, so he chose a different path. He chose to enact a permanent, irreversible financial quarantine. I instructed the shareholders to turn to the third tab in their binders. I explained the mechanics of Winston's brilliant strategy. Over the course of 6 months, utilizing the absolute best corporate attorneys in the country, Grandpa completely restructured the entire empire from the inside out. He quietly created a private, highly shielded blind trust and holding company named Apex Holdings. Once the holding company was legally fortified, he began the massive asset transfer. I walked them through the corporate migration. Winston systematically transferred the title deeds of every single commercial property, every piece of undeveloped land, and every lucrative intellectual property patent directly into Apex Holdings. He moved the liquid capital reserves, the high-yield investment portfolios, and the international banking accounts. He completely gutted the original family enterprise of all actual tangible value. He stripped it down to the absolute studs until it was nothing more than a hollow, empty shell. Richard stood up, his legs shaking visibly. He pointed at the corporate logo embossed on the boardroom wall and yelled that he legally owned the trademark, the branding, and the buildings. I offered him a cold, pitying smile. I told him he owned absolutely nothing. I explained the final, most devastating twist of Winston's legal restructuring. Once Apex Holdings absorbed all the wealth, Winston legally downgraded the original family company into a mere subsidiary. The company Richard inherited was entirely dependent on the parent entity. I explained that the subsidiary did not own the skyscrapers it managed. It leased them from Apex Holdings. It did not own the brand name. It paid massive licensing fees to Apex Holdings to use the logo. Every single operational necessity was leased back to the subsidiary at a highly aggressive compounding premium. I pointed to the financial schedules in the binders. I explained that Winston designed this structure specifically to keep Trent and Richard on a very tight financial leash. As long as Winston was alive, he secretly managed the books. He approved the lease payments, balanced the artificial debt, and kept the illusion of their wealth intact. He allowed them to play pretend executives in a sandbox he entirely controlled. But the safety net had a hard expiration date. The legal structure dictated that the moment Winston passed away, the leniency evaporated. The subsidiary was suddenly required to pay the actual market rates for its leases. The artificial protection vanished. The $15 million deficit they were currently drowning in was not a mistake. It was the calculated compounding cost of leasing an entire empire from a parent company that demanded immediate payment. I looked at the minority shareholders who were now nodding in grim understanding of the brilliant legal trap. I told them that injecting cash into Richard's company would not save it. The money would simply pass directly through the subsidiary and into the accounts of Apex Holdings to cover the outstanding lease defaults. Richard staggered backward, hitting the wall. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with the realization that his entire reality for the last 5 years had been a carefully constructed, humiliating lie. He had been parading around as a king, entirely unaware that he was simply renting his crown from a ghost. He looked at me, desperate for a scapegoat, desperate to find someone to blame. He demanded to know who Winston had appointed to run Apex Holdings. He demanded to know who had been pulling the strings from the shadows while he played the fool. The boardroom was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. I let his question hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment. I wanted him to feel the absolute weight of his impending ruin before I finally put him out of his misery. I reached into my leather briefcase one last time. I pulled out a single perfectly preserved manila folder. It contained the original notarized incorporation documents for Apex Holdings. I placed the folder flat on the mahogany table. I looked at Richard, my expression entirely devoid of emotion. I pushed the folder slowly across the polished wood. It stopped exactly an inch from his trembling fingertips. I watched his eyes dart down to the heavy paper, terrified of what he was about to read. I did not wait for him to open it. I delivered the final crushing blow myself. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "I do. Grandpa made me chief executive officer and 80% shareholder 5 years ago. You did not inherit an empire, Dad. You inherited $15 million in debt, and I am here to collect." Absolute devastation washed over his face. The words struck him with the physical force of a sledgehammer. Richard's knees buckled completely. He collapsed backward into his leather chair, the air rushing out of his lungs in a ragged wheeze. His hands dropped limply to his sides. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His mind was completely unable to process the reality that the daughter he had thrown out into the freezing rain was the undisputed owner of his entire world. The man who had spent his life obsessed with status was completely obliterated in 30 seconds. Trent, however, reacted differently. The golden child entirely stripped of his unearned wealth, his fake title and his pragmatic wife completely snapped. He let out a primal scream of pure rage. He shoved his chair backward so violently that it crashed into the wall. He lunged across the room, his hands reaching out to grab me, his face twisted in absolute fury. He yelled that I was a thief, that I had stolen his birthright, and that he was going to kill me. He never even made it past the edge of the mahogany table. The security guards I had hired that morning moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. Before Trent could take a third step, the larger guard grabbed Trent by the collar of his designer suit, spun him around, and slammed him face first into the boardroom wall. The sound of Trent's face hitting the wood echoed sharply. The second guard immediately pinned Trent's arms behind his back, securing him in a ruthless submission hold. Trent struggled wildly, kicking his expensive shoes against the baseboards, crying and spitting curses. The guard applied more pressure until Trent finally went completely limp, sobbing hysterically against the wall. I did not even flinch. I remained perfectly still, watching my brother humiliate himself in front of the city's most elite investors. I turned my attention back to the minority shareholders. They were watching this scene with absolute shock, but none of them made a move to help. In the brutal world of corporate finance, they recognized the absolute victor. Jonathan, the senior shareholder, slowly closed his binder. He looked at Richard's trembling form and then looked directly at me. He nodded respectfully. It was a silent acknowledgement of a flawless corporate execution. The minority shareholders understood that opposing the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings would be professional suicide. I leaned forward, focusing entirely on my father. I told him that my collection process was absolute. I explained that the foreclosure notices delivered that morning were not empty threats. Because the subsidiary could not pay its compounding lease debts, Apex Holdings was officially seizing all remaining collateral. I told him that the corporate black cards were permanently canceled. The luxury company cars he and Trent drove were being repossessed by the end of the day. The country club memberships were officially terminated. His entire identity, entirely funded by Grandpa Winston's money, was completely erased. Richard finally found enough breath to speak. His voice was a weak, pathetic whisper. He asked me how I could do this to my own blood. He asked me how I could be so incredibly ruthless to my family. I stood up from the head of the table. I looked down at him with absolute coldness. I reminded him of the exact moment he slammed the ledger on the table, smiled triumphantly, and told me I was cut out completely. I reminded him of how he ordered security to throw me out into the pouring rain. I told him that he wanted a ruthless business transaction instead of a family, so I gave him exactly what he asked for. I pointed out that he had stood in front of the entire city and actively tried to destroy my professional reputation with fabricated lies about embezzlement. I told him he had dug his own grave with his boundless arrogance, and I was simply handing him the shovel. The reality of his complete failure finally settled in his eyes. Every desperate move he had made over the last week had been perfectly orchestrated to lead him directly into this boardroom to face his ultimate execution. Richard buried his face in his hands and began to weep. It was the deep, ugly sobbing of a man who had lost absolutely everything. I watched him cry, feeling absolutely nothing but the profound satisfaction of perfect justice. The false kings were finally dethroned. They thought they could discard me and rule an empire, but they were only renting space in my kingdom. Just as the heavy reality of that statement settled over the room, broken only by the pathetic sound of my father weeping into his hands, the frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open one more time. It was Simone. She had not come to support her husband. She had not come to stand by her father-in-law in their darkest hour. She had come to collect. She marched into the room with her chin held high, carrying a sleek leather folder tucked under her arm. She was dressed in a sharp black blazer and designer sunglasses pushed up into her hair, looking every bit the ruthless negotiator preparing for a brutal divorce settlement. She stopped dead in her tracks the moment she crossed the threshold. Her eyes darted around the absolute war zone of the executive boardroom. She saw my father collapsed in his chair, a broken, hyperventilating mess. She saw the minority shareholders sitting in stunned, horrified silence. She saw Trent, the man she had married for his supposedly limitless generational wealth, currently pinned against the expensive wood paneling by my private security guards, his face red and stained with panicked tears. Finally, her gaze landed on me, sitting comfortably at the head of the table, flanked by the city's most expensive corporate litigators and my grandfather's trusted attorney. Simone was incredibly sharp. She did not need to ask what had happened. The power dynamic in the room was glaringly obvious. She slowly walked toward the table, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She looked at Trent, who desperately tried to speak to her, his voice muffled as the guard kept him firmly secured against the wall. Trent whimpered, begging her to help him, begging her to call the police and tell them I was orchestrating an illegal hostile takeover. Simone ignored him completely. She placed her leather folder on the polished mahogany table and looked directly at me. She stated that she had come to present her divorce settlement terms directly to the board of directors. She explained that since Trent's personal trust fund and checking accounts were permanently frozen, she expected the family company to immediately liquidate assets to cover her alimony and a lump sum payout. She wanted $2 million to walk away quietly without dragging the family name through a highly publicized, messy divorce trial. She thought she was holding a winning hand. She thought she possessed leverage. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair and looked at her. I admired her pragmatism, but her timing was tragically flawed. I told her that she was negotiating with a ghost. I explained that there was no family company left to extort. I kept my voice perfectly level as I laid out the exact same reality I had just forced my father to swallow. I told Simone that the subsidiary she thought was worth hundreds of millions of dollars was actually functionally bankrupt. I explained that Trent possessed absolutely zero equity, zero liquid cash, and zero future inheritance. I told her that he was not a millionaire executive, but merely an unemployed liability, drowning in a $15 million deficit owed to my holding company. I watched the last spark of hope completely die in Simone's eyes. The brilliant, calculating woman who had meticulously planned her luxurious future realized she had spent the last 5 years of her life investing in a complete fraud. She had married a man she actively despised, tolerated his boundless arrogance, and played the role of the devoted executive wife, all for a massive payday that simply did not exist. The corporate well was entirely dry, and I was the one holding the deed to the empty land. Simone slowly turned away from me. She walked over to where Trent was still pinned against the wall. The security guard loosened his grip slightly, allowing Trent to slide down the wood paneling until he collapsed onto the floor in a pathetic, weeping heap. Trent looked up at his wife, his eyes wide with desperate pleading. He reached out to grab the hem of her black blazer, babbling uncontrollably about how they could start over, how they could fight me in court, and win back his rightful crown. Simone looked down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. It was the look you give a cockroach before stepping on it. She reached down and violently slapped his hand away from her jacket. She told him that he was the most useless, spineless excuse for a human being she had ever met. She verbally shredded whatever tiny fragments remained of his fragile ego. She told him that she would rather live in a cardboard box than spend another single minute pretending to respect a man who could not even read his own corporate financial statements. Then she delivered her final, devastating blow. Simone raised her left hand, her fingers wrapping around the massive, sparkling engagement ring resting on her finger. It was the ring Trent constantly bragged about, the one he claimed cost him a fortune from an elite private jeweler in Europe. Simone yanked the ring off her finger. She looked Trent dead in the eye and revealed the ultimate humiliating truth. She told him that she had taken the ring to an independent appraiser earlier that morning, hoping to sell it to fund her divorce lawyers. She laughed, a cold, bitter sound that echoed off the boardroom walls. She announced to the entire room that the magnificent diamond was a cheap lab-grown fake. Trent had secretly bought a synthetic replica to save money because he was already quietly drowning in debt before my grandfather even passed away. Simone tossed the ring onto the mahogany table, It landed with a hollow metallic clatter, rolling to a stop, right in front of my father. She did not say another word. She turned her back on her weeping husband, adjusted her designer sunglasses, and walked out of the boardroom, forever. Trent completely broke down, sobbing hysterically on the carpet, entirely abandoned by the only ally he had left. The rats were officially fleeing the sinking ship, and I was enjoying the view from the absolute top. I did not stay in the boardroom to watch the janitorial staff clean up the emotional wreckage. I walked out of the building with Desmond, leaving my father and brother to figure out their sleeping arrangements. Trent had no penthouse to return to, and Richard was entirely too paralyzed by shock to formulate a coherent plan. They ended up retreating to the one place they mistakenly believed was still a safe haven. They went back to the grand family mansion. They thought the massive stone walls and iron gates could somehow protect them from the federal debt collection process. They were wrong. The legal machinery of Apex Holdings never sleeps, and the execution order had already been signed by a federal judge the previous evening. At exactly 7 o'clock the next morning, the crisp Chicago air was violently disrupted by the sound of heavy diesel engines. I was sitting comfortably in the plush leather back seat of my Maybach, sipping a perfectly brewed espresso as my driver turned onto the exclusive tree-lined street of my childhood neighborhood. I was not alone. Trailing directly behind my car was a massive fleet of vehicles that signaled absolute financial death. There were 3 heavy-duty moving trucks, 2 local police cruisers, and a sleek black SUV carrying federal marshals. We approached the towering wrought iron gates of the estate. These were the exact same gates that Richard had ordered slammed in my face just days ago while I stood freezing in the pouring rain. Today, nobody had to ask for permission to enter. The federal marshals stepped out of their vehicle, produced the emergency seizure warrant, and used a set of heavy bolt cutters to snap the automated lock right off the hinges. The gates swung open with a loud metallic groan. The fleet of vehicles rolled up the long, winding cobblestone driveway and parked directly in front of the grand portico. The flashing blue lights of the police cruisers reflected off the pristine white columns of the mansion. It was a beautiful, poetic scene. The marshals did not bother knocking politely. They pounded heavily on the thick oak front doors, announcing their presence with absolute, undeniable authority. A few moments later, the heavy door creaked open. Richard and Trent stepped out onto the front porch. They looked absolutely horrific. They were both wearing the exact same wrinkled, sweat-stained suits they had worn to the disastrous boardroom meeting the day before. Trent looked completely hollowed out, his eyes sunken and bloodshot from crying himself to sleep. He was shivering in the brisk morning air, hugging his arms to his chest, looking like a terrified child rather than a corporate executive. Richard, however, was still desperately trying to cling to his non-existent authority. His silver hair was a tangled mess, and he had dark bruised bags under his exhausted eyes. When Richard saw the moving trucks and the armed officers standing on his manicured lawn, his fragile grip on reality completely shattered. He started screaming at the marshals, wildly waving his arms and demanding they get off his private property. He yelled that he was a highly respected member of the community and that he was going to sue the entire city for trespassing. The lead marshal, a completely unbothered man holding a thick clipboard, simply handed Richard the court-ordered eviction notice. The marshal calmly explained that the property, along with all the luxury vehicles parked in the garage and every piece of valuable furniture inside the house, had been legally seized by Apex Holdings to cover the massive outstanding subsidiary debt. He informed Richard that he and his son had exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever basic clothing they could fit into a single duffel bag before they were permanently locked out. Richard dropped the clipboard. The heavy plastic clattered against the stone porch. The absolute reality of his destitution finally crashed down on him. He had no lawyers to call. He had no hidden bank accounts to access. He had absolutely nothing. The federal agents brushed past him, walking into the grand foyer and immediately beginning the process of tagging the antique furniture and expensive artwork. Trent simply slumped against the stone pillar of the porch, sliding down to the ground and burying his face in his hands, completely defeated by the world he had never actually understood. Then Richard spotted my Maybach parked at the end of the circular driveway. He saw my silhouette through the tinted glass. Suddenly, the arrogant, screaming patriarch vanished, replaced by a desperate, groveling beggar. He stumbled down the front steps, practically tripping over his expensive, untied leather shoes. He ran across the driveway and threw his hands against the tinted window of my car. I pressed the button on my armrest. The heavy glass smoothly rolled down, letting in the crisp morning air and the sound of my father panting heavily. He gripped the edge of the window frame, his eyes wide with pure, unfiltered terror. He looked at me and started pleading. He begged me to call off the marshals. He begged me to let them stay in the house just for a few more days to figure things out. When I did not immediately respond, he played the only card he thought he had left. He played the family card. His voice cracked as he invoked the bond of blood. He told me that despite everything, he was still my father. He pointed to Trent, crying on the porch, and reminded me that he was my flesh and blood brother. He pleaded with me to remember the good times, to have mercy on my own family, and to not throw my own flesh and blood out onto the street with absolutely nothing to their names. He begged for a small allowance, a tiny apartment, anything to spare him the ultimate humiliation of public homelessness. He promised he would do whatever I wanted, that he would publicly apologize if I just showed some basic family loyalty. I looked at him. I looked at the wrinkles around his desperate eyes, the sweat dripping down his forehead, and the absolute fear radiating from his trembling hands. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the cold, sharp satisfaction of a perfectly executed contract. I leaned slightly closer to the window, maintaining complete, icy eye contact. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring every single word cut deep into his soul. I asked him if he remembered the day of the funeral. I asked him if he remembered standing in his luxurious study, laughing in my face and telling me that I had no rights because I was not loyal to his toxic version of the family. He swallowed hard, unable to formulate an answer, his eyes filling with terrified tears. I delivered the final, inescapable verdict. I told him he was the one who established the rules of our relationship. I said, "You told me I was not family, remember? You are right. I am just your debt collector. Enjoy the streets." I pressed the button on my armrest. The tinted glass rolled up seamlessly, forcing Richard to quickly pull his hands back before his fingers were crushed. I tapped the partition glass, signaling my driver to move. The massive engine of the Maybach purred quietly as we pulled away from the curb. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. I did not shed a single tear. I simply watched the iron gates of my past fade away in the distance, leaving them trapped in the nightmare they had so carefully built for themselves. As the car navigated the quiet, wealthy suburban streets, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Desmond. He confirmed that the locks on the mansion had been successfully changed and the alarm codes overridden. The primary assets were fully secured under the Apex Holdings umbrella. The corporate fleet of luxury cars was already sitting on flatbed tow trucks headed to an auction house to further liquidate the subsidiary debt. He asked if there were any further instructions regarding the former tenants. I told him no. The transaction was complete. They were no longer my problem, no longer my responsibility, and no longer a part of my life. The slate was completely wiped clean. The empire was finally secure, and the toxic infection that had plagued my family's legacy for decades was surgically removed. I settled back into the plush leather, breathing in the scent of absolute freedom. 6 months later, the crisp autumn wind swept through the Chicago financial district, carrying with it a profound sense of renewal. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse executive suite, looking down at the bustling city below. The space behind me was completely unrecognizable from the chaotic construction zone my brother had created. The cheap frosted glass and obnoxious neon accents Trent had ordered were completely gone. In their place stood the fully restored, breathtakingly classic architecture my grandfather had always loved. The rich mahogany wall paneling had been meticulously repaired. The heavy antique oak desk was polished to a mirror shine, sitting proudly in the center of the room. It felt less like an office and more like a sanctuary. It was finally my sanctuary. Desmond walked into the room holding a sleek leather portfolio. He did not knock, a silent testament to the deep, unwavering professional trust we had built over the last 5 years. He placed the portfolio on the oak desk and opened it to reveal the final corporate filings. Today was not just another Tuesday in the financial quarter. Today was the official rebirth of the empire. Over the past 6 months, my team of litigators and financial analysts had completely dismantled the hollow subsidiary my father ruined. We liquidated the unnecessary assets, paid off the legitimate vendors Richard had stiffed, and absorbed every valuable piece of commercial real estate directly into the parent company. I walked to the desk and picked up the gold pen resting next to the documents. With a few swift, deliberate strokes, I legally dissolved the old family company name forever. I officially rebranded the entire public-facing enterprise as Winston Apex Properties. It was a tribute to the only man in my bloodline who truly understood the meaning of hard work, vision, and integrity. Richard and Trent were completely erased from the corporate history books. Their names would never again be associated with the skyline my grandfather helped build. I handed the signed documents back to Desmond. He offered a rare, genuine smile, congratulated me on a flawless transition, and quietly left the room to file the paperwork. I was alone in the executive suite, surrounded by the quiet hum of an empire running perfectly under my command. I slowly walked back to the window, resting my hand against the cool glass. If you are currently listening to this story right now, I want you to pay very close attention to what I am about to say. Society constantly conditions women to be the peacemakers. We are taught to absorb the disrespect, to keep the peace at holiday dinners, and to sacrifice our own boundaries for the sake of the family image. We are told that blood is thicker than water, and that we must endlessly forgive the people who share our DNA, even when those people actively try to destroy us. I am here to tell you that those rules are completely fabricated. They are designed to keep you small, compliant, and easy to control. True family does not demand your submission in exchange for their love. True family does not view your ambition as a threat or your independence as an insult. The men in my family expected me to quietly accept my role as the scapegoat. They expected me to cry in the rain when they locked the gates, and they expected me to fade into the background so they could comfortably play their unearned roles. But I did not cry, and I certainly did not fade. I built a fortress of financial independence. I urge every woman listening to do the same. Do not ever let anyone control your access to capital. Money is not just currency. In this world, money is armor. It is the ability to walk away from toxic situations. It is the power to say no without needing to explain yourself. When you control your own finances, you control your own destiny. You strip abusive people of their favorite weapon. My father and brother thought their gender and their arrogance gave them the inherent right to take everything from me. But because I understood complex contracts, financial ledgers, and the brutal reality of corporate law, I was the one holding the keys to their entire existence. You do not have to be a corporate executive to apply this mindset to your life. Setting ironclad boundaries is a universal superpower. When someone shows you they do not respect you, believe them the very first time. Do not wait for an apology that is never going to come. Do not twist yourself into knots trying to earn the validation of people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Cut the cord. Evict them from your mental space just as ruthlessly as I evicted my toxic relatives from that mansion. You are allowed to curate your life. You are allowed to choose a chosen family composed of people who actually celebrate your victories and stand by you during your struggles. My name is Paige, and I am the undisputed architect of my own life. I proudly took the broken pieces of my family legacy and forged them into an unbreakable empire. I hope my story gives you the courage to look at the toxic structures in your own life and start tearing them down brick by brick. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace? How did you build your own independence? I really want to read your stories in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with any woman who needs a reminder of her incredible power. Thank you for listening, and never ever apologize for knowing your true worth.